Office vacancy rates hit a 30-year high as workers and investors stay away from workplaces. Australia's biggest home lender says prices will rise 5% this year, and Mark Zuckerberg apologises for the harm Facebook has caused to children. Welcome to Fear and Greed Business News, Australia's best business podcast. It is Friday, the 2nd of February, 2024. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, after the show today, your interview is with Karen Halligan, the CEO of Oztem, who must have one of the most, probably one of the more challenging jobs within the Australian media.
Yes, so her bosses are 7, 9 and 10, like all three of them. Oztem is made up of those three big media organisations. What they're trying to do is come up with a better data set to provide advertisers in terms of who's viewing, when they're viewing, not just free to wear in real time, but streaming, all those sorts of things. So we talked to her about this new measurement system, which was introduced this week. Really interesting chat about how, I suppose, the legacy TV broadcasters are trying to shift into the new world and take on all those big tech platforms who are incredibly data rich.
Yeah, it is coming up a little bit later on. It comes up after the show. So stick around for that one. The main story, though, this morning, Sean, so much for the return to work fad. Office vacancy rates have climbed to their highest level in almost 30 years. They're 50% higher than average.
Older buildings and those outside CBDs are feeling the effects of the flexible workplace most of all. The office vacancy rate has reached 14.8% nationally. The vacancy rates for both prime and secondary property is highest in Adelaide, Melbourne and Perth, while Darwin's Tier 2 vacancy rate is heading towards 30%, like 1 in 3 buildings isn't occupied. Pretty incredible. It isn't only the work from home phenomenon. The supply of new buildings in recent years has been higher than average. Buildings take years to complete, obviously. Many were started pre-COVID. So suddenly you have all this supply in the market just when there's lower demand. Melbourne's prime building vacancy rate is now above 15%. Sydney's at 12.5%. Brisbane's at 10%. Wow, there are a lot of empty office buildings out there, Michael.
Yes, certainly are. You often hear about the different tiers. What does Tier 2 mean, Sean? I know I'm putting you on the spot with this.
So prime is the best locations, and generally that's facilities, fit out. Facilities like elevators and things like that all matter. Tier 2, subprime, I don't know whether they call it subprime. Tier 2 is kind of the buildings that are older. Generally, they don't have the after-work facilities. They may not have enough elevators. They're just not decked out as well. Cheaper, definitely, but nowhere near as nice as some of the beautiful office buildings in the capital cities. So they're measured in terms of the prime and the Tier 2, and mostly there are more vacancies in Tier 2 than prime, except in a couple of cities, including Sydney.
And so I suppose then that there would be often kind of smaller companies and things that would be occupying that kind of class of building. So it probably tells you something about kind of which companies have really succeeded in getting people to go back to work and which ones are yet to do so.
Yeah, although a phenomenon in the last 5 years or so, which we haven't had in previous cycles, is the shared space workplace, the WeWorks of the world. Mm-hmm. And so you actually have a lot of smaller companies in these prime buildings because they go via WeWork or someone like that to do that. In fact, I was in a building, which is a new building down at Circular Quay, the AMP building in Sydney, only the day before yesterday. Mm-hmm. And there's a massive facility, shared office space facility there. And all these very small companies are working from there. So they've got this prime space, which they would never, ever have been able to afford otherwise.
Oh, wow. What does it all mean then for investors? Basically, what you've talked us through today in terms of these statistics, what does it mean for people that have put money into office property?
Well, it's not good news. In fact, there's a story in the Financial Review quoting Australian Super's Chief Investment Officer, Mark Delaney, saying the country's largest super fund has halved its commercial property portfolio weighting over the past decade. That's globally, of course. Delaney says it's just a very hard sector. Since pre-COVID, late 2019, the S&P ASX 200 real estate index is down about 13%. Now, there's plenty in that index: commercial, retail, industrial. Industrial's done really well. Think of Goodman Group. But the commercial part certainly hasn't done very well. So the index is down 13%. And this is at a time when the ASX 200 hit a new high. Remember, that happened on Wednesday. So real estate investment trusts, REITs, have well and truly underperformed. Now you get the office vacancy figures, which are at a 30-year low. Not so good. And one of the biggest investors in the country reduces its exposure to commercial property. The woes start to add up. At least interest rates are expected to fall, and that should help the sector. Property, I mean, think of your house. You have your biggest debt, Michael, I'm sure, is your mortgage. Same in the property sector, in the commercial property sector. They carry a lot of debt. So when interest rates go down, that's a good thing. Also on a valuation basis, because their share prices haven't done so well, they're more attractive than they might have been a little while ago. So obviously we're not an investment podcast. You need to get professional advice when you're thinking about these things. But just at the moment, it hasn't been a good time for property investors generally outside industrial. And I'm just not sure whether there's much confidence going forward.
Sean, you mentioned a moment ago about the ASX 200 hitting that new record on Wednesday. How did it go yesterday?
Alas, Michael, all those gains on Wednesday were lost yesterday, and the bourse ended the day down 1.2%.
I love any story, Sean, that begins with alas.
Yes.
It suddenly gives a very old English feel to whatever you say. You sound like Stephen Fry as soon as you say alas.
Really? I like Stephen Fry. Anyway, the bourse ended the day down 1.2% to 7,588 points, with financials leading the way lower. Now, that's on the back of revised interest rate expectations in the US. Also, there has been a bit of shenanigans going on in the US banking sector. We had one of the regional banks in New York its share price dropping 30% or so on Wednesday night. Local banks didn't like that one. Among the large caps, Commonwealth Bank and National Australia Bank fell more than 2%. Westpac was down almost 2%, while ANZ was off 1%. This time yesterday, Michael, I said 24 of the top 25 stocks rose in the previous session. Today, 22 of the top 25 stocks fell. Only Telstra, QBE and Cochlear went the other way. Some of the smaller miners, Emerald Resources, Chalice Mining and Regis Resources, were among the worst performers of the top 200. Best were Credit Corp and Tabcorp. In corporate news, shares in Nufarm dropped 1%, having earlier in the day tumbled about 8% after it warned of challenging times in the first half. Lithium and gold miner IGO, as if lithium companies need any more problems. Well, it said it's been served a legal claim by South32, demanding it pays backdated royalties owed to it from mining operations in the Tropicana gold mine in Western Australia. South32 estimates royalties owed to it are $122 million. IGO has pretty much dismissed that claim, said it will defend. And wholesaler Metcash went into a trading halt after the financial review reported it's in talks to buy Superior Food Group for a speculated $500 million.
All right, plenty going on. What about international markets?
Even more in international markets, Michael. It's just been a really big 24 hours everywhere, but particularly on Wall Street, with the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, scotching expectations of a rate cut next month. I hope you like that, scotching expectations. He said, based on current data, he doesn't think it's likely that interest rates will be cut in March, adding that it's not the Fed's base case. The boss of the world's most important central bank commented that while inflation has eased, it still remains elevated. Now, the consensus view among market watchers was that the Fed would start cutting rates in March, and Powell's comments triggered turmoil in financial markets, with equities tumbling. The tech-heavy Nasdaq and broad-based S&P 500 fell around 2%. Bond yields fell. Well, why would that happen? You wouldn't think that would happen. But Powell did say it will be appropriate to start cutting rates this year, hence bond yields, expectations of future rates, they fell. Thing is, they're just not going to cut them next month. Away from equities, oil prices have come off a bit, with Brent crude trading around $81 a barrel. Gold's up, helped by those Fed comments. Bitcoin's trading around $42,000 a unit. And Michael, the Aussie dollar, it's buying 65.5 US cents.
Sean, you can't do that to me. You're going through the story there, and then you say bond yields fell. Now, why would that happen? And my heart stopped for a moment. I thought you were actually asking me, and I'm like, oh no, he's picked my weakness, and it is bonds, as we've talked about. You have tried to explain multiple times. Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. And I just thought he's really got it in for me today. He's actually putting me on the spot, hoping that I would explain that. And fortunately, you answered your own question, and I didn't need to confess anything, and I've done it because I'm an honest person. But please don't do that, Sean.
Okay, I'll reword it next time.
Yeah, just if you're going to ask a rhetorical question, make it clear that it's rhetorical and not actually towards me, because
Right.
it frightens me. It startles me a little bit. Anyway, I will calm my nerves, take a quick break, and we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, federal parliament returns for the year next week, ushering in the pointy end of the debate over whether Labor should be changing stage 3 tax cuts and whether it should actually be doing more than it's outlined.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was again on the offensive yesterday, saying the House of Reps and Senate can decide if they want to provide increased support to low and middle income earners or not. The changes proposed by the government reduces benefits to higher taxpayers but increases benefits to people who pay lower rates of taxation. 8 in 9 Australians are better off under the new package than the stage 3 tax cuts, which of course are already legislated. That's the line that the government's using. Many, many more people are better off. Some of the crossbenchers argue that more should be done to help lower income earners. The Greens have called for higher welfare payments for their support. Now, the Liberals haven't yet confirmed their view. They're in a bit of a tricky spot, since the population seems to be for more tax cuts, but the Libs want to attack the Prime Minister for breaking his promise. It's going to get interesting next week. The debate's also triggered other prominent Australians to push for a broader review of tax, including negative gearing, something Labor said it will not do.
Sean, the latest house price index from CoreLogic shows that in most parts of the country, with the notable exceptions of Melbourne, Hobart and Canberra, prices are still rising. And now the country's biggest lender, Commonwealth Bank, has forecast a 5% jump in prices this year.
The Commonwealth says a lack of supply will keep pressure on prices, although relatively high interest rates will hit demand. Later in the year, the Commonwealth Bank expects interest rates to be first cut in September. When that happens, the demand side will pick up, and that will help prices. The bank warns that there will be considerable divergence between the cities. That's happening already. Perth, Brisbane, Sydney and Adelaide are up more than 10% over the past year or so. Hobart and Darwin have lost ground. Canberra and Melbourne have risen only small amounts.
Just staying in the housing sector, Sean, the total number of dwellings approved fell nearly 10% in December.
Yeah, this highlights what I've just been saying. It's all about units in this instance, with approvals for dwellings outside of houses, i.e. apartments, units, that sort of thing. They fell 25%. For the full year, about 160,000 dwellings were approved, whereas the underlying demand is running at about 220,000, according to AMP Chief Economist Shane Oliver. It just demonstrates that problem we have of an undersupplied market.
Now, PwC, which is, of course, the crisis-struck, would you almost say crisis-stricken? Has it been
I think
stricken? Striked?
Yeah.
Anyway, either way, it's not good. Whichever way you want to look at it, it did not have a good year last year. The consulting firm is one of the country's largest political donors to both parties, while along with the other big three, gave almost $1 million to major parties last financial year.
The annual Australian Electoral Commission figures released yesterday show that Clive Palmer remains Australia's biggest political donor, giving his United Australia Party $7 million in 2022-23. For the ALP, the biggest donor was Pratt Holdings, owner of Visy Industries, which makes cardboard boxes, headed by Anthony Pratt, who, of course, Donald Trump famously last year called a red-headed weirdo. Anyway, I digress. Visy donated more than $1 million. PwC was next at just under $200,000, and then the Pharmacy Guild of Australia at $154,000. PwC was the largest donor to the Liberal Party, $175,000, then Singapore-based Keppel Capital Investment and Sydney Mining Club.
Afterpay's parent Block will cut 1,000 jobs globally, some of which are likely to be in Australia, as tech companies globally look to refocus operations.
So Block bought buy now, pay later provider Afterpay for about $39 billion in 2021. It wasn't quite the top of the market, but it was pretty close to the top of the market. Since then, Block's share price, notwithstanding a bit of a run recently, is down 75%. Not good. Of course, Block is led by Twitter co-founder Jack Dorsey. It also has its Cash App payment tool and Square credit card reader. Tech companies, including Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Spotify, have cut staff on the back of a slowing economy and higher interest rates. This week, PayPal said it would cut about 2,500 jobs, or 9% of its workforce. across the world. Tech companies are struggling and they're cutting jobs, and that's what Block's doing, and there probably will be job losses here in Australia.
Now, one last one before we go international, Sean. A live export ship packed with more than 15,000 sheep and cattle has returned to Western Australia after it was forced to turn back from a voyage to the Middle East and left stranded for days off the coast.
The Israeli-owned vessel made the decision to turn back from a journey through the Red Sea due to escalating conflict in the region earlier this month. While the vessel was expected to divert around the southern tip of Africa, which would have added weeks to the journey, the Australian government ordered it back to Western Australia amid animal welfare concerns, according to media reports. After several days moored off the Perth coast, the ship docked in Fremantle and is expected to offload a portion of its sheep before returning to the Middle East via the Cape of Good Hope.
Turning to international news, negotiations are advancing for an agreement to pause the Israel-Hamas war and free civilian hostages captured by Hamas.
Bloomberg is reporting that any deal will be a crucial step toward ending the 4-month conflict. Conversations are still in the early stages and a breakthrough isn't expected in the coming days. Even so, they said the proposal, which would amount to the longest pause and the biggest hostage release since the war began on October 7, has a realistic chance of success and could lead to a longer-term ceasefire. According to one identified official in the Bloomberg report, spy chiefs and top officials from Qatar, Egypt, the US and Israel agreed on a framework in Paris over the weekend. Qatar presented Hamas with the proposal that would see a 45-day pause and the release of some Palestinian prisoners in exchange for all the women, children and elderly Israel hostages.
Now, one, Sean, that I mentioned at the top of the show, Meta Platforms' Mark Zuckerberg and the bosses of TikTok, Snap, X and Discord have faced withering bipartisan criticism from US senators who said social media must bear more legal liability when children are harmed online.
Yes, as Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina, said, "You have blood on your hands." That triggered applause from a packed audience that included many holding pictures of children, some of whom had self-harmed because of social media. The executives were blasted for a crisis in child sexual exploitation online. Zuckerberg, who got many of the most pointed questions, told politicians that there are positive aspects of children's interactions on Meta platforms. He also praised Facebook's investment in child safety work, saying the company has gone beyond legal requirements in seeking to remove abusive material. Now, after being continually pressured, Zuckerberg eventually stood up, turned to the crowd of families and said he's sorry for what they have been through. Meta reported about 27.2 million instances of suspected child sexual abuse material on its main platform in 2022, far more than any other company. The US total for all platforms was about 32 million, 27.2 million from Meta/Facebook.
Isn't that number terrifying?
Terrifying.
God, that's just... God, don't really know what to say after that. That is really quite confronting. Now, Sean, you have an interview coming up today. Change of pace, definitely, with this one. Karen Halligan from OzTam is your guest.
All about the new measurement that the big broadcasters, 7, 9, 10, are using to demonstrate what audiences they have. It's much more inclusive, so it includes streaming services and catch-up video as well as the real-time free-to-air. We talked to Karen about how that works and what it's like when your bosses are the most competitive networks in the country. Very interesting. She laughs. I've got to say, she's extremely, Karen Halligan, I don't know her, but she seems like a very pleasant person. And we start off by saying, how the hell do you work for those three groups of people when they're all ferocious competitors? And then she laughed. I'm not sure what that meant, Michael. I think it was good.
It means that she's being very diplomatic, Sean. It's interesting, isn't it? Because TV ratings are one of those things that we all discuss. Like, we all talk about kind of the records set by the Matildas, or we talk about kind of which show was a hit and kind of the fact that everyone is watching Married at First Sight and all of this. But no one really understands how the numbers are actually kind of gathered. Yeah. How we know how many people are watching and what it suddenly means when we do have catch-up video and we've got everyone watching on different devices. You can sit on a train and watch maths. I don't know why I'm so focused on Married at First Sight at the moment, but clearly it's kind of
it reflects
managed
something
to seep into my consciousness. But and that's why I found this interview really interesting, because it does kind of go into that and explain a little bit behind something that we all kind of think we understand, but probably don't. So it's well worth sticking around for. It's coming up next. You'll find it in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Friday, the 2nd of February, 2024. Make sure you're following the podcast and please join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson and that was Fear and Greed Business News. Have a great day.